Hey everybody, it's Alex Miller at Capnion here. I hope you enjoyed the holidays. I've got a bit of a backlog of interesting and unfortunately possibly important legal carnage to cover. In this video, I'm going to talk about a lawsuit announced in just the first few days after Christmas, with the New York Times suing OpenAI over the inclusion of a lot of news in ChatGPT's responses. If you've been tinkering with these things, one big limitation you might have noticed if you were just playing with the freemium version of ChatGPT over the web is that it doesn't know anything about current events, and it'll tell you directly. I believe the date's moved a couple times, but it'll give you a date and say, I don't know anything before this date. For a whole lot of applications, that's a big limitation, and it's pretty easy to fix in principle. One way you could do it is just have a bot go to the New York Times website and pull all the articles and have ChatGPT read them as needed. I talk about this elsewhere. This is a form of retrieval augmented generation, and you could do something fancier as well, get it done by another means. This raises a lot of legal questions because what kind of compensation should OpenAI have to give the New York Times if they're doing this institutionally as a standard way of getting the news into their widget for you to enjoy or incorporate into an app telling people the news or what have you? I like this one as an example for a video because I can tell the story a little bit like I'm a bad guy. So I'm going to go deeper into why this lawsuit might not do so well, as ugly and disadvantaged as the New York Times position is looking. And then I'm going to talk about what are the perils for you if you're an IT leader, you wanted to use these tools, and what other kind of shoes could drop a little down the road. But starting off with making myself the bad guy, part of the value I'd like to provide you is reading the news for you. You've got a lot on your mind. You can't follow every story that's out there. So, of all the noise, what is really relevant to a business leader, or what really moves the needle? So I'm reading the news and regurgitating it to you, which is a very common practice. And even in the internet era, most of the news is reading the news somewhere else and regurgitating it to you. This is pretty established. If it's a public event, something happens, I can talk about it, and I don't have to pay the New York Times for being the one that enlightened me. So, from a purely abstract legal standpoint, I don't know if the New York Times position is that great because somebody can and will argue that what OpenAI is doing so much resembles what is already well established you're allowed to do. That being said, it's easy to see why the New York Times is mad, and it's begs a little bit of inspection of, well, how am I different? How is Alex Miller different from a ChatGPT? I have no incentive or ability to talk to you all the time, whenever you want, about the news and know all the news. I'm a limited human being, and I'm coming through in a tactical way to do this strategically. OpenAI, via their chatbots, really can do that. ChatGPT potentially could just read all the newspapers every day and just chat with you about them. And there's real potential there for LLM to be a kind of universal news machine. And it's easy to imagine no one would ever need to go to the New York Times again. If you pushed me too far, all the stuff I'm telling you would lead back to, hey, you could just read it in the New York Times or Google TechCrunch. So to some degree, I am still playing along with the original game, in that the New York Times might like what I am doing because I am driving your appetite for news, and I am never really gonna functionally replace what they're doing. At some point, you might read the news yourself. But with so many things, LLM pushes these things to a scale, does things in a comprehensive way, has potential economic impact that's really big. So you could look at it from a purely legalistic way. ChatGPT is just doing what I'm doing at a different scale. But then if you look at the potential long-term impact on the New York Times, it really does look more from an economic standpoint like, yeah, something's being stolen that's of value and that should be of interest to the law. I don't know how these principles will balance out. I generally, what people tell me, and I don't know if it's tainted my tone here, is that the New York Times position is a little shaky, but we'll see. And anybody that tells you they know absolutely everything about how these will shake out, there's not a whole lot of history, and that's really the best thing you can have in these settings. So this is definitely one to watch. I want to provide a little happier backstory and then alert you to some other dangers. So a few interesting details. Apparently, the New York Times had been negotiating with OpenAI for 9 months, and this represents them giving up. Axel Springer, who among many magazines like Politico that it runs that are relevant, they made all these yellow books behind me. They've already done a deal with OpenAI like this one that the New York Times failed to do. The Associated Press already did. Shutterstock already did. So there's a nicer route here, which is that OpenAI should just pay, and then we don't have to have a lawsuit. In some cases, that worked out. In the case of this New York Times situation, it broke down. I would point out something a little scary in the fine print, which is that New York Times is demanding the destruction of LLMs that use their information. I could see this being a real headache in that if you're depending on an LLM that a judge decides needs to be totally different and this sneaks up on people, that could represent an interruption of service for you if you were serving an app to someone else, but then your LLM was coming from an OpenAI API. And that would be a real headache. I suspect it could get resolved quickly, but I don't really know. And this is something worth watching in the space broadly, is that because the technology is so new and there's so many hiccups around it legally, there's a lot of potential for different kinds of situations where suddenly you were buying this from somebody and you can't buy that service from them in the same way overnight. And that's not the kind of thing we like trying to run a business. Finally, I think Reddit is a really interesting tangent to bring up here. My understanding is Reddit is a real goldmine of material for training LLM. If you're asking an LLM about obscure topics and it knows anything, it may be that the original source material is Reddit. Reddit's an interesting case where they've been around 18 years and they're really big and important, and they have never had any ability to make money. And they're trying to IPO now. It's easy to see a lot of turbulence around Reddit. And it's easy to see that what way Reddit goes could actually have some kind of significant impact on the quality of LLM, given that these data sources, as I understand, are really important, and you're not just going to replace Reddit overnight. So let me bring it all back. New York Times is suing OpenAI. It's one of many cases where LLM uses a ton of intellectual property in a way that resembles something that's totally okay in the past, but is on a scale now that looks a lot more problematic and people aren't sure what the law is. If you're a business leader, not only is it good to know about evolution of IP law to stay out of trouble, but if you're buying this very sophisticated widget from one of not very many vendors, and an interruption of service would be a big deal to you, you need to watch these things too, because it could be any day a judge creates a problem that they pass on to you. So watch this one and the others like it.